endanger the lives of the American people for this showboating and grandstanding. So anything they do out here to act like it's just covering the rear ends, because they know they're the ones responsible for defunding the Department of Homeland Security. That means TSA agents. That means the travel of the American people. That means the Coast Guard. That means Secret Service. That means investigating people who are trafficking children here. This is a wildly bizarre, out-of-step ideology at this point, where open borders is now in their DNA, and their refusal to want to get rid of people who shouldn't be here in the first place, and prioritizing people who are here illegally over American citizens is nuts. Which leads me to the SAVE Act, the Save America Act. This is about making sure that American elections are for Americans, and also protecting women and girls from having men participating in their sports, and children being mutilated and offered up at the altar of a radical ideology. Yesterday, Democrats unleashed a coordinated barrage of lies about this amendment. This amendment that I had, the substitute amendment, the Save America Act. President Trump's talked about it, widely supported. They've told lies about it, from claims of voter suppression and mass disenfranchisement to the absurd charge that it somehow makes it harder for married women to vote. How insulting. How insulting. It is pure, unadulterated fear-mongering without any basis in fact or in law. And so today I rise to do one thing they fear the most: present the actual text of the bill. The Save America Act has three clear claims, this amendment that's pending. Title I, Save American Voters, restores integrity to our federal elections. What could be more important in this republic, this continent-wide republic, where we've committed to ourselves this idea of self-government and structure, to make sure that people who are voting are who they say they are, and they're not here illegally. It requires proof of citizenship to register to vote, requires voter identification, makes in-person voting the rule for able-bodied Americans while preserving absentee ballots for our military, individuals with disabilities, caregivers, those who are sick, those who are even traveling, and verified hardship cases that the state can determine. Title II, Save American Sports, defends biology and biological reality in women's and girls' sports. And Title III, Save American Children, protects innocent children from irreversible medical mutilation and chemical castration. That is what we're actually debating. Not all these lies and all the nonsense to distract the American people from really popular issues, 80-20 issues, 90-10 issues. These are common sense issues, and they're very afraid of them. They're very afraid of having to vote on these things. They're very afraid of these things becoming law, because it's really difficult to go back home and explain your no vote on that. That you think only Americans can vote in American elections. But the Democrats would rather fight ghosts than facts. The Democrats claim this bill targets Democrat voters. That's a lie, the most revealing one of all. This bill targets only fraudulent and illegal voters, non-citizens who have no right to our ballot, and cheaters who refuse even the most basic safeguards of lawful voting. If my Democrat colleagues want to stand here and suggest that requiring citizenship and voter ID somehow threatens their political coalition, they're free to make that argument. But maybe you're protesting just a little bit too much. But the American people are listening. The Democrats claim that voters will have to show up at the polls carrying proof of citizenship. That's false. That's not what the bill says. This bill allows any individual to make an attestation at the polling place if it's questioned about his or her citizenship. If you're registered to vote, you remain registered to vote. So no, the bill doesn't require American citizens to drag a file folder of citizenship papers to the polls. They call it Jim Crow 2.0. It's worth remembering that it was the Democrat Party that withheld the franchise from black Americans. It was the Democrat Party that waged a civil war to keep people oppressed because of their race. So these claims are total nonsense. What this bill does require is far more modest and far more reasonable that the Americans at least attest, that you have to attest that you're a citizen. People believe that citizens should vote. Non-citizens don't get to vote. I know my Democrat colleagues wanted 15 million people here illegally to count in the census and mess with reapportionment because they've lost the argument with American people. But that's not what this bill does. It says that only Americans can vote in our elections. Let me say that again. My Democrat colleagues have pulled a 5-alarm fire because this bill asks people to simply attest that they're U.S. citizens when they duly register to vote here. That is not suppression. That is not disenfranchisement. That's the bare minimum of seriousness in a self-governing republic. American elections are for Americans. And spoiler alert for my Democrat colleagues, federal law already requires applicants to attest that they're citizens when they register to vote. 52 U.S.C. Section 20508B2 requires the federal voter registration form to include a statement that includes citizenship. All we're doing here is taking that from a box-checked exercise to something that an election authority can actually verify in an individual assessment. That provision, by the way, was introduced by a Democrat congressman, passed by a Democrat-led Senate, and signed into law by a Democrat president. Oh, how times have changed. I've seen a clip recently of the minority leader begging for fraud protections, begging that photo ID be presented when people vote. But something has happened. The Democrat Party has been completely radicalized and believes that illegal immigrants should be able to come here, never have to leave, and now vote in our elections. But today, that same common sense idea that I just mentioned is slandered as Jim Crow. The Democrats claim that the bill text disenfranchises married women and name changes. That's also false. The text of the bill makes plain as day that married women, they're not going to have to re-register to vote. All they have to do is attest that they're an American citizen. And they're afraid of these facts because they know if people are aware of the facts, this remains an 80-20 issue, a 90-10 issue. And it makes it really hard for them to explain their no vote. It couldn't be any easier. This is common sense. It's actually insane and ridiculous that we have to debate this. So their talking points are wrong. It's reckless. And again, an attempt to frighten the American people. They claim it abolishes absentee voting. That's also false. It ends the failed COVID-era experiment of mass mail-in voting by default, the same disorder that weakened the chain of custody, blurred deadlines, and undermined public confidence. When the leftist lawyers streamed all across this country in 2020 trying to undermine voter integrity laws, when I was Attorney General in Missouri, we stood up, we fought back, we won all 3 cases. We didn't settle those cases and allow some ridiculous election process where ballots are just sent out whether people requested them or not, random drop boxes all over, no way to verify the votes, deadlines didn't matter. This bill actually does preserve absentee voting for Americans with real needs, our military members, the disabled, caregivers, and verified hardship cases, those who are sick, those who are traveling, and others. They claim it triggers mass purges of lawful citizens. That's false. They know it. In other words, the pattern here is simple. They don't want to debate what's actually in the bill. They want to terrify people with things that are not actually in the bill. Because the truth is that this amendment, the substitute amendment that I've offered, is built on 3 propositions that normal Americans understand immediately. Citizenship matters. Biological reality matters. And protecting children matters. Mr. President, this Senate was not sent here to traffic in slogans or manage decline. As America approaches her 250th birthday, the least we can do is prove that self-government still means something, that a nation still has the right to define membership, that elections still deserve rules, that women and girls still deserve protection, that children still deserve adults willing to defend them. Read the text, debate the text, then have the courage to vote for it. The time for excuses is over. The time to govern and to defend our republic has arrived. Pass the Save America Act. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I would like to talk for a few minutes about the SAVE Act. I'm a co-sponsor. I support it unconditionally. The SAVE Act, as you well know, Mr. President, is really pretty simple. It's about our sanctity of voting in America. It says if you want to register to vote in America, you have to prove that you're a citizen of America. And once you're registered, it says when you're voting in a federal election, in all instances, you have to prove you are who you say you are in order to vote. Very simple. Now, there are other provisions that may or may not be added by amendment, but those are the guts of the SAVE Act. Many, I hope not all, but many of my Democratic friends in the Senate are opposed to the SAVE Act. They say that we're setting our time on fire here in the Senate. We're just wasting the Senate's time. We're wasting precious floor time. Many of my Democratic friends say that we should read the law, that the law provides very clearly that, and has since God was a baby, that in order to vote in America, you have to be a citizen of America. My friends on the other side of the aisle have come up with this deeply weird theory that somehow this legislation punishes women in America. Because some women, not all, but some women take their spouse's name when they get married, and that somehow will, as if the women of America are not smart enough to figure it out, that somehow will impede their ability to register to vote and to vote. I don't get that part, but I hear my colleagues. My Democratic friends say that this bill is unnecessary, but it's also going to cost money. and that what we're doing in proposing it is we're wasting taxpayer money. We're taking a Great Dane-sized whiz down the leg of every taxpayer in America. And I could go on. I hear them. My Democratic friends have no claim to a high horse. Let me just say that. We wouldn't be here today passing this legislation if some of my Democratic friends had stood up to the Biden administration. But I want to make it clear, I hear my colleagues, I think they're wrong, but they're entitled to their opinion. Now let me explain what this bill is really all about. I'm not going to talk about the details of the bill. I think enough people have done that much more eloquently than I probably could. I want to tell you what this bill is about. It's about people trusting elections in America. And it's about immigration. Now, I happen to believe, and I think most Americans agree with me, that the United States of America is star-spangled awesome. I think this country is the greatest country in all of human history. I think the whole world knows it. When, Mr. President, did you last hear of somebody trying to sneak into China? The whole world wants to come to America. I consider that to be a compliment. And we have a way of welcoming them to America. It's called legal immigration. Is our legal immigration system a modicum, rather a model of efficiency? No. We need to make some changes. And maybe, hopefully, someday we will. But it works, and I'll tell you why it works. Over 1 million of our world's neighbors every year become American citizens. Nigerian doctors, Romanian plumbers, over 1 million Americans, more than any other country, we welcome to become American citizens. Now, the opposite of legal immigration is illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is illegal. Duh. We have laws against it. If you don't like them, you should change them. Our immigration statutes are not some second-tier laws that you can violate without consequence. They're the law. And I support their enforcement. And so do the vast majority of Americans. Now, how you enforce them matters. Our immigration laws should be enforced respecting human dignity. Our immigration laws should be enforced in accordance with due process. Our immigration laws should be enforced in accordance with equal protection and with the standards of reasonable suspicion clearly set forth in I think it was 1969, a Supreme Court case called Terry v. Ohio. We should follow the law in enforcing our immigration laws. You have the right to protest. You don't have the right to protest violently. In fact, as I've said before, violence undermines the morality that the protesters say their movement is based upon. That's not an original idea. Dr. King knew that. Gandhi knew that. Mandela knew that. Violence is also dangerous. You can get hurt. And it's been my experience that most cops, and members of ICE are cops, most cops will leave you alone unless you do illegal stuff. Their job is to enforce the law. So protest all you want to, but don't do it violently. It is not going to end well. Now some have suggested that the American people are xenophobic and that they're racist when it comes to immigration. These people suggest that vetting people at the border is racist. I think it's prudent, and I think most Americans think it's prudent. Let me see if I can explain why. If I could ask these folks to keep this door shut for 10 seconds, please. Thank you. Most Americans, I read this somewhere once. Most Americans look at the southern border like they look at the front door of their home. Most Americans lock their front door at night. Why do they do that? They don't lock their front door at night because they hate everybody on the outside. They lock their front door at night because they love the people on the inside. And they lock their front door because they want to know who's coming into and out of their home. And that's the way people look at the southern border. They don't hate everybody that wants to come into America. In fact, we welcome 1 million of them, but they want to know who they are. They want folks properly vetted. That's why we have immigration laws. Now, remember a few minutes ago, I said my Democratic colleagues had no claim to a high horse? Let me explain why. When President Biden was president, and by the way, I wish him well in retirement. I hope he's doing well. He's had some illnesses, cancer. I wish him well in his retirement and in his health. But when President Biden was president, either he or some of his advisors who had authority on his behalf admitted into our country millions of folks illegally from all over the world. We don't know how many, 8 million, 12 million. Some people say 30 million. I don't know how many. But President Biden, it was like the price is right. Come on down. You don't have to follow our immigration laws. Just come on in. Now, I don't really know who was running President Biden's immigration program. I really don't. But I know this. They were one or two things. They were either so incompetent you wouldn't put them in charge of a ham sandwich, or they believed in open borders. I think they believed in open borders. And many of my Democratic colleagues who knew better, they did not say a word. And as a result, we have millions of people in our country. We don't know who they are, but we know they're in our country illegally. And a lot of Americans are opposed to that. It's one of the reasons, I think, that Vice President Harris lost the election. Why do most Americans oppose that? Well, first, as I told you, most Americans believe in the rule of law. They understand that illegal immigration is illegal. Most Americans think it's prudent, not racist. It's prudent to vet people at the border. Most Americans understand that if you want to come to our country legally, we have a process, and that it's unfair to people who have been waiting patiently in line to be properly vetted to allow anybody who can get across the border to jump the line. Most people understand that in America understand that viscerally. And many Americans, let's just put it on the table, Mr. President. Let's just put it down here where the goats can get it. Most Americans, nope, strike that. Many Americans believe that this was a plot, it was intentional by President Biden and some of my Democratic friends to admit people illegally into America so that perhaps at some point these folks would be indebted to the Democrats and would vote for them. I'm not saying that's true, but you've been smoking a doobie if you don't think that a lot of Americans don't believe that. They believe this was intentional. Again, I'm not saying it's true. And when we point it out, many members of the press go catatonic and foam at the mouth and say you can't say that. But they're living in la-la land. A lot of Americans believe that. And a lot of Americans believe, whether it's accurate or not, that these folks vote today and that they undermine the sanctity of our elections. So that's what the SAVE Act is about. It's about trying to get the American people to trust our elections every year in light of the fact that President Biden and his team, with the concurrence of many of my colleagues in this chamber, admitted millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people into our country illegally. I'm not saying they were all bad people. I think many of the folks who came into our country were economic migrants. They just wanted a better life. That's why we have illegal immigration. Not all of them were Cinderella. There were a lot of criminals. There were a lot of murderers. There were a lot of sex traffickers. There were a lot of drug dealers. There were. We're trying to catch them now. But I guess the larger point is we don't know who the hell they were. Because once again, price is right. Come on down. And so that's what this bill is meant to do. It's meant to say to the American people, look, we in Congress hear you. We want you to trust our elections. My personal feeling about getting people to trust our elections, I think if we did two things, I'm supporting this bill, but I think we ought to do two things. Number one, have a rule that says you have to prove you are who you say you are in order to vote, and I guess I would add to that in order to register to vote. And number two, we need to go back to having an election day, not election month. Because when it takes longer than just an election day, people think the worst. But the SAVE Act will help as well to restoring trust in the American system. Because you know what? Our democracy can't stand if people don't believe in the sanctity of folks that we put in charge to administer that democracy. Now let me say one last thing, Mr. President. You know, I'm in the minority on this. The majority of my colleagues on the Republican side, and I feel very confident on my Democratic side, the majority of my colleagues don't agree with me on this. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes the majority just means all the fools are on the same side. Sometimes someone in the minority can be right. That's why we have the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is not for the high school quarterback or the prom queen. The Bill of Rights is for people who see the world a different way, and they have the right to do that. So I'm in the minority on this. I don't know how this bill is going to turn out. I can't predict the future. I have to wait for it like everybody else. But if the SAVE bill doesn't pass, SAVE Act doesn't pass, and we're serious about passing it, and I think we are, Mr. President. I know you are. We need to try to pass this legislation through reconciliation. Now, you know how reconciliation works, Mr. President. It means we can pass this bill with 50 Republican votes and the Vice President to break the tie. That's how we pass the one big, beautiful bill. I would hope to get some of my Democratic friends to support us, but we don't have to have them. That's harder than I described because, as you know, Mr. President, there are parameters on reconciliation. Anything you propose through reconciliation has to be paid for. We can find the money to pay for it. And anything you pass through reconciliation has to conform with the contours of the Budget Control Act. We call that giving a provision a bird bath. And our parliamentarian decides what passes muster under the Budget Control Act and what doesn't. Now, we've got a lot of smart lawyers in the United States Senate. Every single one of them thinks they're Oliver Wendell Scalia. But we've got a lot of other smart lawyers in America. Here's what I'm getting at. We have yet to try going to these smart lawyers, some in the Senate and some, believe it or not in the Senate, and saying, craft us a SAVE Act that will pass muster under the Budget Control Act and can be blessed by the parliamentarians. And some of my colleagues, those Oliver Wendell Scalia types, they say, Kennedy, you know, that you'll never be able to do that. They don't know. I've been here 10 years. I've seen things pass muster, survive a bird bath that I didn't think had a hope in hell. And I've seen provisions pass the parliamentarians' judgment under a bird bath that I thought, I've seen them not pass that I thought were slam dunks. You don't know till you try. And we haven't tried. And if this bill is as important as everybody says it is, and I think it is, because we're not just talking about voting, we're talking about the confidence, the trust of the American people in our elections. If this bill is as important as we say it is, we should try it through reconciliation. I haven't convinced Senator Thune of that. I haven't convinced all my colleagues on either side of the aisle. But I plan on continuing to chase them like they stole Thanksgiving and Christmas put together. Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate you listening to my explanation of what the SAVE Act. Did I mention I support the SAVE Act? Did I mention I'm a co-sponsor of the SAVE Act? I just wanted to clear that up, Mr. President. And the real reason that we're here today. So I'm done, Mr. President. What would you like me to do? Put us into a quorum call? Yeah, it's okay with you, Max? Oh, you're not Max, you're Brian. Okay. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
being able to pay for child care. They're worried about the rising costs of health care premiums. And we're here debating a bill that is going to have the federal government intervening in how states operate elections in ways that make it harder for people to vote. I don't have any objection to my colleagues here who were talking about they support the SAVE Act because they believe only American citizens should vote. That's the law. Only American citizens can vote in American elections. Nobody's trying to change that. What this law is trying to do is make it harder for American citizens to vote. And I know from personal experience, because New Hampshire passed a similar law, House Bill 1569, in 2024. And then Governor Sununu signed that law, making some of the most sweeping changes in generations in how people in the Granite State vote. And we've seen the results now. We've had 2 municipal elections. We've had the elections in 2025 where our cities voted, and we've seen the town meeting elections in 2026. That law was in effect, and what we saw is that voters showed up with driver's licenses as an ID, and they were told that wasn't enough. That didn't match the requirements of the law, just like the SAVE Act says it's not enough. Women showed up with birth certificates, and they were told it didn't match their legal names, so that wasn't enough. They couldn't vote. First-time voters showed up expecting to register, and they were told they needed a passport. Each of these voters came prepared with an ID. In New Hampshire, we require photo IDs. Each of them had photo IDs, and each of them was told they didn't have what they needed. That's what this debate is about. It's about whether people who have photo IDs, who are registered to vote, can actually vote. And in our polling places in New Hampshire, in town halls and high school cafeterias and public libraries and churches and fire stations, when an eligible voter is told they don't have what they need, in many cases they're not told anything more, not what documents are missing, not how to fix it, not whether they can still vote that day. They're just told no, they can't vote. And if they can't come back because they have work or child care or transportation, then they don't get to vote, even though they're eligible. And that's what should concern all of us, Democrats and Republicans, unaffiliated voters. As I said, only American citizens should vote in American elections. Nobody's trying to change that. That's the law. It should be enforced. The question before us is straightforward. Does this SAVE Act make it easier for eligible Americans to vote or harder? Does it disenfranchise voters or ensure that people who are legitimate voters who want to vote are able to go to the polls and do that? So to answer that question, I think we need to look at the problem this bill is meant to solve. And when you look at the data, non-citizen voting is exceedingly rare. I mean, like so rare, it's less than 1/100th of 1%. Even organizations that have gone looking for non-citizen voters have found fewer than 100 cases over more than 2 decades, over more than 20 years. Now, what the SAVE Act says you have to do in order to register to vote is that you have to have proof of citizenship that is a passport or a birth certificate. And we know that 146 million Americans, almost half of all Americans, lack a valid passport. And some of my colleagues said this was not going to affect women. Well, I'm sorry, but it is going to affect women. Because if women are married, like me, and took their husband's name, like I did, my birth certificate doesn't have my married name on my birth certificate. And not only that, I didn't have easy access when I applied for a passport, and I was an adult by the time I got a passport. I had to send away to Missouri because that's where I was born. It took me weeks to get my birth certificate. We know that about 69 million married women have taken their husband's name and they don't have birth certificates that match their current legal name. So in New Hampshire, our Secretary of State, who has refused to comply when this administration, this Justice Department said, send us your voter rolls, he said, and the state of New Hampshire said, we're not going to do that because the state conducts our elections, we're doing this appropriately, and you don't need the voter rolls. But he said that instances of voter fraud are minuscule, and he's a Republican. I think if this were a widespread problem, we would expect a bipartisan effort to address it. But what we're considering is a very partisan bill that blocks eligible voters. More than 21 million Americans don't have easy access to documents that prove citizenship. Many don't have documents that reflect their current legal name. As I said, my birth certificate doesn't have my current legal name on it. In some cases, that means that voters have to leave and return multiple times because their documents don't match. To Madbury in 1979, when we built our home there, I've run for office about 10 times. My name has been on the ballot. Everybody in the town of Madbury who's part of the voting process knows exactly who I am. I got into the polling place and they said, nope, you can't vote. We know who you are, but you got to go get your voter ID. Well, fortunately, I'd left it in the car, so I went out and got it and brought it back. But for a lot of people, if they have to go home and get the documents that they need, often they're not able to get back because the polling hours in some polling places like Madbury don't go all day long. They start at 11 in the morning and they're over at 7 at night in Madbury. Now, as I said, in the municipal elections, what nonpartisan observers found was that at least 244 voters were turned away. In some communities, it was as many as 1 in 10 same-day registrants who couldn't complete the process. Women were turned away because their documents didn't match their current legal name. In March of 2025, New Hampshire Public Radio reported that Brooke Young of Derry had to make multiple trips to the polls because her documents didn't match her married name. This wasn't limited just to new voters or to people unfamiliar with the system. It included people who had participated in our elections for years, people like me. This bill prevents Americans from voting, and that's not acceptable. I think we can enforce the law. We can ensure that eligible Americans are able to vote. Today, voters already confirm they're eligible under penalty of perjury. Election officials already have tools to verify that information. And in states like New Hampshire, before House Bill 1569, we had a system that allowed voters to register and yet still required documentation to be provided. For years, voters who didn't have documentation could sign a sworn affidavit and provide it after the fact. That gives local officials clear, workable standards. Right now, under the Save America Act, the affidavit that's required doesn't provide guidelines for voter registration officials to understand what's required for proof of citizenship. It creates this new bureaucratic process, but then it doesn't give state officials the details on what they need to do. This bill moves us in the direction of replacing a system that has worked in practice with one that risks turning eligible Americans away. One of my favorite examples, because it's so outrageous, of what happened in the municipal elections in New Hampshire is that we had a former Republican executive counselor. In New Hampshire, we have this position called executive council that's a carryover from colonial days. It's a 5-member elective body that approves all state contracts and all of the governor's nominees. And we had a very prominent former executive counselor, Republican, who was turned away at the polls because he didn't have the required documentation. Not because he was ineligible. He had changed wards from one ward to another, and because he had changed wards, he had been purged from the voter rolls. So he went back and got the proof of where he was living, and they said, oh no, because you've been purged, we need proof of citizenship. Again, this is somebody who had run for elective office multiple times in New Hampshire, who was well known to election officials in the Republican Party, was well known. He had to go back. He was asked to go back and get proof of his citizenship. Unfortunately, he couldn't produce that proof of citizenship in the time required before the polls closed, and so because he didn't have it, he wasn't allowed to vote. That's what happens under this law. That's the consequence of this approach. And it doesn't just affect new voters, voters unfamiliar with the process. It affects people who know the process well. It doesn't strengthen our election system, it weakens it. And at a time when my constituents in New Hampshire are paying more to heat their homes, when fuel prices are spiking, when gasoline prices are spiking, the fact that we're here debating this instead of debating how to help people address the rising cost of living, how to make their to oppose this bill. And let's get
there were alternatives, someone who acknowledged the enormous cost and the lost opportunity to the country that comes with excessive spending on armaments. He is famous in his farewell address for warning of the encroaching influence of the military-industrial complex. And we should turn to that speech now to remind ourselves of where we are in this moment as we find ourselves at war once again. Eisenhower said, meals and spending them instead on missiles. Have we agreed as we send our sons and daughters on ships, members killed and 200
can tell us what their plan is to stop the war and get to an end state in Iran that would make us safer, not more threatened. Then, when the case has been made, when Congress's debate is done, we must vote. It's our burden. It's our responsibility. It's the least we can do for those willing to sacrifice everything to safeguard our democracy. But until and unless they do that, we here need to do everything we can to force the administration to do their part. And we can start by passing this War Powers resolution offered by Senator Booker. So to my Republican colleagues, please.
Page of the briefing book that a president would get on the consequences of a major military strike on Iran would be that missiles and drones would start to be sent to American bases, American forces, and our partner forces in the region. Reports are that the president just kind of guessed that they wouldn't gum up the Strait of Hormuz. Even though the second page of that briefing book would have told you, you know what, the first thing Iran will do if you assassinate the Shia religious leader in the middle of the holy month and bomb them relentlessly day after day, hour after hour, they will close the Strait of Hormuz. No plan to protect our partners in the region. Our partners are
$5 million. The Virginians are paying every day $5 million more for gas because of this war. I talked to a prominent American airline. They're paying $25 million a day more in fuel cost than they were before the war because of the war, and they passed that on to passengers who were traveling.
To oppose President Trump's war in Iran. I also rise on behalf of the families who just want him to fulfill his promises, to lower costs, and if my Republican
also show that 71% of Democrats support voter ID. But instead of listening to their own voters, Democrats in Washington claim that the Save America Act is, yes, Jim Crow 2.0. Apparently, asking voters to confirm that they are who they say they are is racist. That's laughable. Just think about all the different places you've been asked to show your ID lately. Last weekend, I took a flight. Had to show an ID. Terror on the United States. Destroy Iran's vast missile arsenal and make sure Iran can't rebuild it. It's a lot easier to kill the archer on the ground than to shoot his arrows out of the sky. Second, strike at the pillars of the regime.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it.
That Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that, unquote. This is a lie. In the 3 million or so documents that the DOJ has disclosed to Congress under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, there is credible evidence that Donald Trump committed a crime. And that, of course, excludes the nearly 3 million pages that the DOJ is refusing to turn over. Donald Trump is mentioned thousands of times in the Epstein Files. There are multiple allegations that he sexually assaulted young girls. But I want to focus on one victim's allegations that the FBI unquestionably found to be credible. The DOJ tried to hide reports of 3 of the 4 interviews that this victim gave to the FBI, but pressure from the media and Congress forced them to disclose them. And now we know why. She credibly accuses Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her when she was between 13 and 15. In each of her interviews, this victim recited the same account of her interaction with Donald Trump. On August 7th, 2019, she explained that she was between 13 and 15 when she was left alone with Donald Trump, who, quote, mentioned something to the effect of, "Let me teach you how little girls are supposed to be." Trump unzipped his pants and put her head down quote, down to his penis, bit the S out of it. Trump struck the victim and said words to the effect of, "Get this little B the hell out of here." The victim advised that she bit Trump's penis because he disgusted her. She provided some additional details in the next interview 2 weeks later, and then a month later, she met again with the FBI and asked, quote, what the point would be of providing the information at this point in her life when there was a strong possibility nothing could be done about it. She didn't speak to the FBI again. But the FBI certainly found her story credible. In a 21-page PowerPoint presentation that the FBI made to prosecutors, they included this victim's testimony. They would not have done so if they did not find the evidence credible, which means that Attorney General Bondi lied when she stated under oath that there is no evidence that Donald Trump committed a crime. But we're just scratching the surface, because the Epstein Files also reveal that Donald Trump has made false statements over the past quarter century about Jeffrey Epstein. We know in 2002 he called him a terrific guy and said, quote, it is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. In a birthday card, 2003, that Donald Trump gave to Jeffrey where Trump told him, thank goodness you're stopping him. Everyone has known he's been doing this. What innocent person calls the police chief about an investigation upon just learning about it? The recent documents also show that Jeffrey Epstein emailed Ghislaine Maxwell and said, quote, I want you to realize that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump. Redacted victim spent hours at my house with him. He has never once been mentioned. Trump also denied that he ever went on Epstein's plane. But of course, the Southern District of New York said that he was on his plane 8 times, often with young women. The reason why this matters is because we don't have half of the Epstein files. And if the Attorney General is covering this up in such a degree that she is redacting things from Congress, that she then, redacting things from the public that she then shows to Congress, what else is she covering up? And I would just show that this document here was redacted to the public, it was unredacted to Congress, and it completely disputes everything that Donald Trump has said about Jeffrey Epstein, about what he knew about the allegations, about his disgusting behavior, about whether he'd ever been to Epstein's house, saying, I may have been there with my wife. Asked if any young girls were there. No. He may have had children of guests, but that's it. Well, we know that's not the case. Now, why is this important? Because if the Attorney General is covering up this information that she then reveals to Congress, what else is she covering up about Donald Trump's involvement in the Epstein files?